Welcome back to part 3 of our discussion on Mark 1 through 10. This is for the class The Bible and the Novel at George Fox University, where we've been comparing contemporary works of fiction with the biblical text and thinking about how bringing more literary eyes to the text might help enliven the stories of God and God's people. We're going to focus in this section on character in particular, the other characters that surround Jesus, the characters who are missing, and the character of Jesus himself. And so to get started, we're going to jump into the part where Jesus is like calling his disciples together. Well, we could start, of course, with John the Baptist, who is, of course, another important character who gets a very long death narrative that also doesn't seem to fit very well. So we can start with John the Baptist, or we can start with the calling of the disciples, but we need to address both. So where would you guys like to begin?
I think we should start with the calling of the disciples just because it kind of makes sense chronologically within Mark's depiction of the Gospel of Mark, I guess.
Okay, so yeah, so we have the baptism, and then John disappears until we find out he's dead. But then we get the, after John's put in prison, Jesus goes and starts proclaiming the good news and starts calling disciples. And this is in chapter 1, verse 16. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. When they had gone a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. I just want to say, if my kids' friends walk past and say, "Hey, let's go, we're going to go do this thing," and they're in the middle of doing a chore, and they just like stop, I'm not going to be very impressed.
Yeah, how does that contribute to their father's faith of now Jesus is the guy who just called them away from their job, now what do you think about him?
Yeah. I love, like, they've got the net in their, I mean, Andrew and Peter, they're casting the net into the lake. Like, you get this sense of like mid-action. Like, do they just drop the net into the water? Do they bring it in first?
Yeah, I'm struck by the starkness of just, they left their father Zebedee in the boat. It just, yeah, it reeks of like disrespect almost.
Like, come back here, you kids! I also find, I mean, like, yeah, go ahead, Ellie.
I also found it interesting that certain characters are like known as sons of whoever and other ones aren't, and also maybe the importance of maybe their dad was like a famous fisherman or someone who was like a lot of people knew, and so to like have a father that may be a high kind of figure in whatever occupation you're in, and then just to leave him, I think would get a lot of kind of like suspicious views for maybe people that bought fish from you. Kind of like, your son's just ditched you for this random guy. Like, that is not normal.
Right. I mean, whether he's known in the church or known in his community, for some reason, this is a helpful way of distinguishing who these two are as opposed to other Jameses and Johns running around for sensuality, right? Like, this is a useful way of identifying them. And it reminds us that they are part of these family units, right? That they've got a dad who's in the boat who they've just ditched to follow Jesus.
Yeah, I think this points out that like they're not just nobodies doing nothing, just like waiting, like just like sitting like on a bench, just like, oh, I'm hoping that somebody walks by and like gives me something to do with my life. Like, they have some sort of like at least occupation, and like so they're a part of society in some way. They have these family units, like they're actively doing other things, and Jesus disrupts that. They're not just like sitting waiting being like, oh, I hope the Messiah comes and I can go and follow him.
Right. You know, what this reminds me of is like in Ocean's 11 or like, you know, any sort of like heist show where you've got like the team and they're all going about their normal life and they get the call, right? It's like, okay, boys, it's time. And they just kind of ditch whatever because they know that this thing is now happening. And it's totally anachronistic, right? But it feels very much like a kind of like getting the team together because like the time is now. Of course, that assumes that there's also a backstory. Like, they already knew each other. Because otherwise,
I also kind of hear it as sort of playing to our worst sort of for lack of a better word, like FOMO, like the starkness of like just abandoning their father in the boat. So if I'm watching like James and John, and they do something so dramatic, it seems maybe the only logical assumption is this guy Jesus is really compelling, and maybe I want to get in on that because he's so compelling that they just did this very sort of socially disrespectful thing to their father and ditched their livelihood. I don't know. I wonder if part of it is meant to kind of like, again, sort of like align us with the disciples and stir us up to the choice that we're going to make about whether we want to get in on this too.
Yeah.
And
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
as they just stand up and as soon as Jesus walks by, seemingly they just drop everything. Is that an act of obedience, or is that like, how would Jesus respond to that? Like, no, I meant finish what you're doing just then. And that's just the first mark of the disciples' humanity, because Jesus is just like, oh my gosh, guys, like, bring your father in on the boat. Like, don't leave him there.
Yeah. That would be really interesting. So, okay, this is where though figuring out like the rhetorical positioning or like the sort of narrative framing around something is so important. Because think about Messiah. When we were watching people kind of drop everything to follow Al-Masi, all of us expressed a sort of discomfort with that, like, ooh, like, do you just like is Felix doing the right thing, ditching all the people who need help in Dilley, Texas to like go on a road trip with Al-Masi? Is, you know, the people in Syria, as they just start like tramping out across the desert with him, like, ooh, is that like the right choice? This could be super dangerous. And so in that narrative framing of it, it seems like the entire point of the story is to put us in this question of discomfort with what's happening. Like, ooh, I'm not sure if I want to be part of this or not, or are they all crazy? Like, who does that, right? That's one way. Back to Ocean's 11, you see that framing of it, which is actually the same sort of thing, right? People are just like suddenly dropping everything to go join up on a team. But it's participating in a different sort of rhetoric that's like, no, this is exciting, get in on this, something's about to happen, this is the story you want to be a part of. And we don't ask any of those questions. We're like, yes, of course she would just leave her daughter at school and let someone else, grandma, go pick her up or whatever, and she'd go join the heist team. Or of course he would just ditch the auto mechanic and, you know, job and jump onto repairing crazy vehicles. I don't know, you know what I mean? Like, it's always that sort of, like, of course, it's totally logical that you would do that. So I think to figure out what's going on here, we kind of have to figure out what is the tone of this passage? What is it doing? Is it inviting us into skepticism, or is it inviting us into a sort of energy that says, yeah, the time is now, this is what we want to be a part of?
That reminds me of what Jason was saying, and I don't know if it was the first or the second video, about like kind of the adrenaline of this like book in general, of like, oh, it's kind of like inciting us and like getting us like involved, and that there's like this visceral connection like to the text in some way. So I think if you read it with that, then you're kind of like into the fact like, oh yeah, like they have to go and do this in the same way you would with a heist movie, but you don't necessarily get that same sort of adrenaline in Messiah. You get kind of this like, oh, this like wariness and like reluctance, and like it's kind of like slow and like a lot of tension. Which you don't necessarily get in this because of how abrupt it is. Like, oh, they're just going and they're doing it.
Yeah. Well, I think this, oh, go ahead.
No, you're good.
I was going to say, I think this is where your comment in the last video about everybody knows the end of the story, right? Like the reading community knows what's about to happen.
Right.
And so there seems to be, it seems to then lend itself to that energy, right? That, yeah, the story's getting started now. Whereas if you've got a different reading community or a different setup to the gospel, maybe that wouldn't be the case. It's interesting where they go straight away too, right? Because they head straight away into Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, they go to the synagogue and begin to teach. Like just straight in, like straight into the church. Like,
what do you guys make of right before he calls this? I'm just thinking of the energy and urgency of chapter 1, 14 and 15. John's been arrested.
mm-hmm.
Jesus is proclaiming the good news and saying it's now, repent, and then he invites them. I don't like, if I just back up and take in a little more of the text, I also kind of like read these early disciples as sort of the first exemplars of the response to verses 14 and 15.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point, right? They're the first people to repent and follow him.
Yeah, to like literally get up, turn, and go wherever he's taking them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in Messiah, after they make it to Washington, D.C., and we see that class in some sort of college setting where the students are discussing the implications of if Al-Masih is the Messiah, what does that mean? I think it's kind of interesting how that one student just stands up and he says, well, if he is real, then this class is pointless. And he just stands up and walks away. So it's interesting to see those reactions of people if this is the case and we're being told to repent right now. Like, what do we do? What's our first move supposed to be? Are we supposed to dive deeper into this theologically and stay in the class? Are we supposed to get up and leave and find our purpose somewhere else, where that guy just continues to walk aimlessly and doesn't really seem to have much of a purpose? But I think that's kind of interesting.
No, that's such a good point, Jillian, because yeah, there is that great moment where he's like, well, then this class is pointless, and he walks out. And then you get the sense of that urgency of, if this is for real, it's not something that I can kind of like choose to opt into or choose to not opt into, and it doesn't really matter. There's a sense of like actual reality behind all of this. And if it's actually real, you got to do something.
But I think this idea of dropping everything for Jesus is kind of romanticized in a way, where it's seen as, oh, we're supposed to drop everything. Like when the man comes to him and he doesn't want to leave his wealth, but he's supposed to drop everything for Jesus. But then in chapter 7 of Mark, Jesus is talking about how everybody's leaving the commandments of God to hold down the tradition of men. Like, you think it's so amazing that you're giving everything up, but what are you going to have left to like support your parents? How are you supposed to honor your mother and father? So it's this difficult conversation about, we're told to drop everything. But I mean, in the same way that Jesus is calling the first disciples and they just drop everything and they go, I almost think that Jesus is kind of sitting here thinking like, well, not everything, like finish what you're doing just then and then come. But it's kind of this, they're kind of like puppy dogs. As soon as they see the bone or the tree, they just start going. But they need to finish where they were at. And the same thing that Felix completely deserts his community and just goes.
Yeah. And we do see that tension in Messiah. I'm thinking about the moment when Al-Masih says to Felix, who do you say that I am? Do you think I'm like the Holy One? Like, well, then why don't you fall down and worship me? Right? And kind of like, if that's what you really think. So yeah, I mean, because how are you going to support your parents if you've left everything to follow Jesus? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if now's the time, do you stay in the boat? So it seems like from the very beginning of Mark, we've got this sort of constant sort of address to the reader. What would you do? Would you jump out of the boat immediately? It seems like Peter is still somewhat connected to his family, though, because we end up in his mother-in-law's house not very far later, right? Mm-hmm. Where is that? Verse 29.
Yeah, 29. Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they leave everything. Peter ditches his boat, but then he's still able to go to his mother-in-law's house, which, of course, begs the question, too, where is his wife in all of this? Right? The disciples aren't, one of you was commenting during the break, that the disciples aren't just single guys with, you know, time on their hands. They can just take off and do what they want. Like, Peter's got a wife, potentially children. What is he leaving? And is that the right thing to do? Or is he leaving those things, but or are they coming with him? Like, I mean, and again, back to Messiah, right? Rebecca and Felix's wife are there. They just have their own sort of experiences of Jesus or of Al-Masih. So do Peter is Peter's wife there maybe? Having her own skeptical experience? Like, what are we doing here?
Well, it's interesting how in Messiah, I don't remember their names, but the young girl with cancer and her mother, I think maybe her husband's name is Jonah or something like that, or Judah. Yeah, Jonah. And so she just leaves, doesn't tell him, and leaves him behind. Yeah. And when we see it like that, it's not a good thing. especially because she's leaving behind the treatment, which we want to say that's going to be more beneficial. But did she do the right thing by standing up and following Jesus? But we also don't really know what her faith was like, because obviously she had a lot of hope, but how much faith did she actually have? Or was it more desperation?
I think one thing too, Zebedee isn't left completely alone. Like, he still has hired men on the boat, and so their job is still, I mean, it's made harder now that there's less like bodies like working, but like he's not completely abandoned. And I think that's what's different with, like, in the instance of like the mother taking her daughter, like she's taking her daughter away from something and like not knowing if there's any sort of like, oh, like she's not bringing cancer treatments on the road, you know what I mean? But when they leave the boat and they leave their nets, they're not just like leaving one person alone to like row everything back. Like, there's hired men on there too. And so there's this idea of like, okay, yes, like they're leaving, but they're not leaving people like destitute. Like, they're still able to like continue like their commerce and their occupation, like what they're doing. And so, and then later on we see like, oh, like they're still connected to their family in some sense. And so I think like, yeah, like the view of like, oh, dropping everything for like the church and going to being a missionary in some like remote place, like that is super romanticized. But I don't know how, like, if that's actually what's happening here. Like, it seems a lot more practical of like they're leaving, but they're leaving people that with the ability to continue working in some sense.
I think that's a really good observation. And I think that's why it's so important that Peter's mother-in-law probably comes up later, that whatever choice they have made to follow Jesus in this really sudden, what feels very sudden, it seems to be this gathering together of an energy of the time is now, like it's happening. It's interesting that it's triggered by John's arrest, right? That there seems to be like an actual event that is like, okay, now it's time, that triggers all of this into motion. But they're not fully, they haven't become completely estranged from their families in this choice. So again, how do you negotiate that, right? Reader, where do you stand? What does it mean for you to leave the boat and follow Jesus, but make sure that your mother-in-law will still let you come back next weekend, right? Like, you know, how do you negotiate that complicated dynamic quite often?
I wonder,
yeah.
So I was gonna say, I just wonder for whoever this is really written for out of the gate, like, I think it's pretty apparent, right, that like the Jesus movement, I don't know about you guys, I grew up, there were no family consequences for being a Christian, and there was lots of social reinforcement for being a Christian. But I'm guessing most of Mark's readers, or many at least, like are facing their own sort of sense of leaving family to follow Jesus, only because if they're Jewish, for example, or I guess if they're not, but like, I wonder too if this just makes room for the experience of these readers who in a very real way probably had to forsake some kind of family bond. Maybe they're no longer welcome at the synagogue, or maybe their family has actually kicked them out, right? Maybe it's a solidarity with the reader at their own loss of family.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, that for most first century Christians, it was not easy. It cost a lot to follow Jesus. And I think that's one of the things I appreciated about Messiah most, is it made clear to me how easy it is to be a Christian. I've always taken, Jesus says to Thomas, you see because you believe because you've seen, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. I've always taken that as like, I'm like better than Thomas because I didn't have to like touch Jesus to believe. But after watching Messiah, I was like, maybe I'm like blessed because I have 2,000 years of theology and history and society and politics and all these things that make my faith so easy. But for Thomas, he has to confront the fact that like there is no space in any of the worldview he's grown up with for what he has just seen with his eyes and touched with his hands. And he has a really hard road ahead of him, much like a lot of these first century Christians, right? Because like, I'm not so sure I'd be ready to fall down and worship Almasi.
Yeah. That's really strong. That's really strong. We have this massive edifice built, this cultural, institutional, societal edifice built around the thing that we've all kind of said yes to in some way, right? With none of that edifice to say yes to just the kind of the man, the movement, yeah, wow.
And this gospel seems to make it clear really quickly that you are going to be kicked out of your communities, because of course they go to the synagogue straight away and everyone's like, wow, this guy has authority. I love it that there's a man in the synagogue who is possessed by an evil spirit, who cries out, what do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. What is a demon-possessed man doing in the synagogue? Like, no, seriously. And then I started to wonder, like, do the other people know that he's demon-possessed?
That was a question that just popped up for me. Yeah. Is this the moment when they found out they've been sitting next to Joe with a demon for a decade or whatever? Like, I just didn't know it?
Or do they know yet?
Hmm.
Maybe he's one of the leaders. Like, he could be some powerful, rich guy who people admire. He could they could think he's just being sarcastic. What have you come
until the demon convulses within him, right?
to Right. Until the demon convulses and comes out with a shriek.
Mm-hmm.
And then the people are amazed.
Mm-hmm.
And the news spreads about him, but they have to leave the synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then they leave.
Mm-hmm.
And people start crowding around, but you get the sense that this is not going to be easy. This is going to disrupt a lot of what we take as good and established and right and proper in the world. And that, yeah, the person that was sitting there that you might have been sitting with for 10 years and never knew that he was actually possessed. And I love the people's response. Like, oh, he has authority. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing in their mind.
Forgive me, Jess, if this is like off topic for us, but this scene and others remind me, one of my frustrations with Mark is how there's this reference to his teaching, but we get very little of his teaching, I feel like. And maybe that's kind of how I'm wired too. Like in a little while later in verse 38, when he says, "Let us go on so I may proclaim the message there also. For this is what I came to do." So I came to proclaim the message. But we don't get Matthew 5, 6, and 7 out of Mark. We don't get like lengthy treatises from Jesus. We just get these sort of scant allusions to the fact that he's here to proclaim the message of the kingdom. And I know that in Mark, it's probably more that it's being sort of borne out through the things Jesus does rather than the things he says. But me, I like things really didactic. I want pages of I want Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And we never get that out of Mark, which is just it's kind of frustrating to me as a reader, but I suppose that's kind of part of what he's doing, right? That it's that the message is embedded in all the things we see Jesus doing.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And part of it then puts the onus on the reader to figure out what the message is from what Jesus is doing. Mm-hmm. Right? There's no well, we can just go to his words and argue it out there. We have to think about what it looks like in flesh and blood. Right?
I'm the guy when I go to an art museum, my temptation is to read the placard next to the work of art before I just take in the work of art. And as a discipline, I try to make myself sit with the work before I read the explanation.
Yeah.
And it's like Mark, we get the art, but we don't get that explanatory thing very deeply, which can be really powerful, but it's frustrating for me.
It is, but as you're saying that, it makes me realize it also gets us at the frustration of the incarnation, right? That we can't get away from a God who does things in the world in flesh and blood, and the problems that creates, mm-hmm. Right? And we have to wrestle with what Jesus actually does. Whereas I think it's oftentimes easier to have sort of ideological debates or halakhic discourse over what this law means and how we accurately apply it. And it can stay very abstract, but it's really different when suddenly you're in the synagogue and there's a guy there who's demon-possessed who's saying something against Jesus who just stood up to teach. Or when the friends are bringing the paralyzed man to these are it puts flesh and blood on everything, mm-hmm. in a way that I think we can lose in John and Matthew in particular. Mm-hmm. But it also makes it more problematic, right? Because then well, wait, but is this like the exception to the rule, or is this the rule that I'm supposed to follow? Seems to also mm-hmm. be what the tension we're being invited to debate. Because as we were looking at I'm thinking of the chapter 5 story again, am I supposed to follow Jesus on the road, or am I supposed to go back to my place and tell who Jesus is? Yeah. We get the importance of circumstance for shaping what right action looks like, that there's not a one-size-fits-all sort of spirituality.
Yeah, and sometimes the job of the text isn't to tell you what to do, but rather to provoke a discerning journey. Yeah.
Yep. And I think that's really contrary to the way that North American Christianity in particular has kind of gone about things, right? We don't want a journey of discernment without a predetermined end. Like, we want to get it right because for many of us that have grown up in the evangelical tradition, salvation, like whether or not we spend eternity with God in heaven or eternity being tortured with Satan in hell, is the way that it's so often characterized for us, right? Is dependent on right theology. Like, I've got to pass the test. I've got to answer the questions correctly. And if that's our model of accurate faith and accurate discipleship, of course we don't want a journey of discernment. Of course we don't want a text that forces us to think about, like, what would I do in this situation and how would I deal with the nuances of this problem? We want to know what the right answer is. Because otherwise we might be in a lot of trouble. And so Mark seems to really undermine that entire sort of epistemology or way of thinking and say, no. You have to actually like think about this in your own life, in your own body, in your own community. What does this look like? What does this mean for you, reader? Which is why it's the beginning of the gospel.
I think Mark doesn't allow us to be passive in our faith and in our discipleship, whereas like the other ones, that you can be very passively like abiding by like the teachings of Matthew or the teachings of John and being like, okay, like, yes, like I agree to this. And it's much more like a headspace thing versus in this, like you have to kind of like get out of your head and be called into some sort of like action like with this. Like you're not allowed to just be like complacent, because there's nothing really to be complacent to, because you have to fill in a lot of blanks for yourself.
I also think about, I'm thinking again about them leaving their family and the sort of, the way that the disruption of Jesus often costs us some experience of belonging, like some pre-existing experience of belonging is often at stake when we go with Jesus, and how, to kind of your point, Jess, not just that like we might miss out on heaven if we don't get the right answers, but that like our spiritual communities, our churches, our whatever, our tribes are often also like the boundary markers of those communities are not, hey, we're following Jesus together. The real boundary markers are, no, we share these conclusions. Like that we all come to the same answers on the theology test about some of the details, and that's how we belong to each other. And if you come up with a different answer than I do, then do we really belong with each other? But Mark would make it really hard. It'd be really hard to like build a community around Mark and guarantee that we're going to come to the same conclusions as a form of like knowing our bond with one another.
Right. I mean, it seems like I was going to say that the bond is like who's on the road with you, except what about the demoniac?
Yeah. Who's sent back? Yeah. Doesn't get to go on the road with them.
Yeah. So even what I would like, it's like, well, no, but there's actually not even that. Like it really puts a lot of pressure on the community to engage this together and think it through as a body. And I think that this desire for answers, I'm thinking about like just Protestant tradition generally, right? Like Protestantism exists because of this idea that like having it right is the basis of community, right? We're with Luther, or we're with Calvin, or we're with now the 60,000 other people that I think there's about 60,000 different Protestant denominations we can choose from, right? We're with George Fox. There's always, this sense of ideology as the formative bond. It's interesting then that Mark is the foundational, like one of the earliest of the Gospels, and that the other three that come up are like much more about right thinking. Which is probably important to keep in mind, that like the Gospel of Mark puts us in this place. The biblical text as a whole, the witness of the Gospels as a whole, doesn't invite us to just like chuck thinking out or chuck theology out or anything like that. That you need both, but we do need, I think, this counter of Mark to that sort of really heady Christian faith. It's super fun for nerds like me. Like, don't get me wrong, I love theology. I love hashing out, readings of passages, and but we have to have, I think, also like space in our communities for the people that Mark will speak to as well. That maybe there's something to the living out of this in a vibrant, dynamic, and difficult way that either they're just not interested in the conversation around theology, or parsing out what Jesus means in John 6, and whether he's like, it's really his body and blood in the Eucharist. I think that's a fun conversation. Some people don't. We have to have space maybe for both. I don't know. And we've got Gospels for both. So maybe that's part of the grace of the text as a whole, is there's room for a lot of us. But Mark does make us choose a lot, and maybe is also a good counter to people like me. Like, no, you gotta,
No, as you're talking, just the more I'm thinking about how uncomfortable I am with Mark. I really, he's kind of abrupt. I'm like, whoa, slow down. Like, feel like you were kind of tactless in the way that you went into that next story or whatever. And yeah, maybe that's a good discomfort for me. But for some of the reasons you're saying, Jess.
Yeah. It's funny, Mark's my favorite gospel, but it's also, I think, because it makes me uncomfortable and it makes me do the work as a reader, which is probably why I ended up doing my PhD in literature and not theology to start, right? Like the literature was the primary area and theology was the secondary area, because I think I actually enjoy that discomfort as a reader, and like the sort of the creative demand it puts on me. But it is also the one that makes me the most uncomfortable, because I don't know what to do with it all the time. It creates the most problems for me. But also I'm a teacher, so I know that's going to create the most like problems for my students as well.
And you're happy about it, aren't you?
I am. I'm really, I'm just like all teachers, a little bit sadistic, right? Like one squirm. So we were gonna talk about characterization a bit and kind of some of these other characters. One of the things that starts to become really clear, though, as we start looking for other characters, is we don't have a lot of like other main characters to locate ourselves with, right? We were just talking, like, we've got Peter here, but then we don't see him again for a while. We hear a mention of Peter's mother-in-law, but we don't have some of, like, the other characters don't feel like they emerge in the same way. At least that's my take. Do you guys feel like there's other characters who really emerge, maybe help give us insight into Jesus? Or where are you locating yourself in terms of some of these other characters?
I think that there's a reason why it feels as though like there isn't a lot of emphasis on the other characters, and I think that's because like the main like crux of Mark is that like this entire story is like us following Jesus on the way to his death, and so it's like it's a biopic on Jesus in a sense of like that. It's not like the other characters are important, but it's not necessarily about like, oh, establishing a church or like how are the disciples going to like respond or like filling in some of those theological blanks. Like it's very much like we're following this man on the way to his death. And so the main character and like the character that we get the most on, and it's not even that much, is Jesus.
Yeah. And of course, we're missing some of the other big characters from other gospels pretty much entirely. Like Mary, the mother of Jesus, doesn't show up in these first 10 chapters. Well, she's outside at one point and he kind of seems to disavow her. Mary Magdalene doesn't show up in these first 10 chapters. We get a bit of Peter, we get a bit of James and John, but they're not there.
Yeah, and I mean, skipping ahead to like what wasn't like required to read today, like the fact that this book does emphasize like the death of Jesus, not necessarily the resurrection of Jesus, like the functionality of the women isn't the same as it is like in the other gospels, where like the women are the one that like are the first evangelists. Like they declare like, oh, like Christ is resurrected, like the defeat of death, all those things. But that doesn't necessarily, sorry to skip ahead, happen in this. Like again, the emphasis is Christ leading to his death and then his death. And like that's the climax of Mark. And so then if you're writing that, the women don't play a significant role in the end of Mark, so they wouldn't be inserted in the beginning of like the narrative as well. Whereas in other books, like they do, and like they're talked about, like they fund the like the ministry of Christ, and like they're on the way, they're on the road, they're with them, they're the ones that are at the death of Christ, they're the ones that proclaim the resurrection. And so that not happening in Mark is why you're going to see a lot of those characters like removed and not emphasized.
Right. It also doesn't give us any place to locate ourselves with like a particularly sympathetic character who gets it right. Like it's easy to want to like identify with Mary Magdalene or to identify with John, the beloved disciple, right? Because they're like, they seem to be the ones who get it in some of the other gospels. Mark doesn't give us anyone to locate ourselves with. We have to be kind of responsible for our own identity and relationship to Jesus, and not just map on someone else's predetermined journey. Which gets back to that engagement that Jason and I were just talking about, right? Like that sort of, So we've gotten rid of the women. We've kind of removed all the other characters in a profound way. Jason, you're smiling.
So the thing that I've had a slowly growing affinity for the Pharisees. Because, and some of this is me trying to understand sort of through a historical critical reading, and some of this is me like inside the narrative, and some of it was watching Messiah reminded me that like, and I'm not super strong in my understanding of this, right? But a lot of what I gather, if we try to kind of really understand what's going on with them, is that they're really invested in a certain way of being the people of Israel, not unconnected from the political and military context of their occupation, but precisely in relationship with it. That, right, like if I understand the sort of consensus reconstruction that like these guys, they read the vulnerability of Israel's sort of situation with Rome as sort of calling for a certain way of obedience, because it's really precarious, right? Like there have been uprisings and genocides and all these things, and like so then Jesus comes along and his sort of apparent flaunting of this way of being Israel. I guess I don't read them as like these nasty legalists these days. I more read them as people who have a kind of white-knuckled grip on a certain way of being Israel because they don't want this thing to get worse. And then watching Messiah and seeing all the ways that people are concerned about the disruptive act of this guy. I've spent a fair amount of time in Jerusalem, and just in that opening episode, when Messiah starts walking up the steps to Al-Aqsa and Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, I'm like, oh no, don't do, because I've been up there, and you can feel the tension. You see the sniper towers. This whole geopolitical thing is really like right on the brink, and it's like a powder keg. And today I read the Pharisees as people who, they have it wrong clearly, but I sympathize with some of the things that might compel them to be so afraid of the disruption that Jesus is bringing. So I was smirking because I just find them actually really relatable, and sometimes they're actually where I find myself if I'm trying to be honest about like how would I relate to Jesus.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're very much right about what Messiah opens up around that, because you also see that the Pharisees, like, was kind of underlying everything you've just said, is they're actually really concerned about the good of their people, about the good of Israel, about people not dying, about like how do we actually preserve life here? We don't want the Romans to come in and just massacre us. And that's not an imaginary history for Israel, right? They've seen it happen with the Assyrians. They've seen it happen with the Babylonians. The temple that they're talking about all through the Gospels is the second temple. And the very fact that it's the second temple is always a reminder that there used to be a first temple that was destroyed, and this is what we suffered as a people. So yeah, they're not even coming out of it like they're not even narky legalists. They're actually like deeply compassionate human beings who are trying to keep their people that are under their leadership safe and healthy and flourishing, and this guy's a threat to that.
Which for me really helps me think about where in my life it might actually be God coming toward me, but like I see it as a threat either or for me or for my carefully constructed world that I think I have created for the well-being of others. Like just all those sort of well-intended like delusions about I'm the one holding this together in the right way. Don't you come and interrupt this. I think that's very real for a lot of us. I know it is for me.
And we've seen that throughout the biblical text in this class. I mean, one of the things, like, it feels like one of the recurring themes I'm saying class session after class session is the way that God comes to us in ways that are deeply disruptive, in ways that mess with everything we think we have in order, and also comes to us in our darkest places, in our most problematic places. And where we expect to find condemnation, we frequently find grace. And where we expect to find grace, we frequently find condemnation. And I mean, we've seen that like Genesis. So I mean, yeah, all of that strikes me as very right. And also then really problematic, right? Because then I, as the reader, am placed back in the same place. Like, okay, so how am I still doing that? How am I still thinking that I am creating a world that is for the good of others and might be missing out on God coming to me in my own life? Because I don't think I'd follow Al-Masi, if I'm being really honest. But would I follow Jesus and Mark? Is his character compelling enough?
I see Jesus as more compassionate than Al-Masi was, because in a lot of ways, I feel like Al-Masi and Messiah left his people. Like when they go through the desert and then he gets taken, I mean, he could return if he wanted to, but he never does. So I think watching Messiah had kind of helps Jesus's character more, which I've always seen him as a very good and compassionate person. But especially in Mark, when there's some chances where maybe he's a little bit coy, I think it was easier to read him as compassionate and loving in a lot of those ways, just because he is seen taking care of his people, whether it's by feeding them or explaining to them. I think he is.
The feeding narrative is important, right? Because when we think about like provision, like of just a basic sort of need, none of them were probably going to starve to death. They would have just been hungry while they walked back to the village. It also, of course, ties us again into Exodus, right? Who is it who provides for the people in the wilderness? And we never see Al-Masih providing in the way that God provides for Egypt or for Israel in the wilderness, or for the way that Jesus provides for the crowds. With just like, here is some fish and some bread. Yeah. Did any of you find it funny when Jesus is talking to them about the yeast of the Pharisees in the boat after he fed the 4,000?
I found this one of the more enigmatic sort of moments.
Mm-hmm.
He just, to me, he's kind of like, it's kind of almost non sequitur. He just like, I don't know. I mean, I know they're talking about bread and whatever. I found it kind of a strange little piece of the story.
Yeah. It does feel like a non sequitur, because he's just like, it just comes out of nowhere as far as we can see, except for they're on the boat. They discussed this with one another, like, because they also feel like it's a non sequitur, and said, it's because we have no bread. I almost feel like Jesus might have said this just to provoke this conversation, just to make them realize how slow they are to believe what they're seeing. Because if you read this in one big hit, like I did last night, one of the things that becomes clear is like, you've got a feeding, you've got some other stuff, you've got another feeding, and then they're in this boat and they're saying, we forgot the bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Have your eyes failed to see and your ears failed to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketful of pieces did you pick up? 12, they said. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you pick up? 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? They're so worried about the fact they forgot to bring bread on the boat. It's like, you've just seen me feed multitudes twice. Do you think the problem is I can't make bread? Do you still fail to understand? So I mean, I kind of feel like this conversation, like, I find it really, really funny, because I could just like, I'm thinking like with my own kids, right? Like, guys, like, what happened when this happened? And then when this, like, you know, you're kind of like walking them through this process of reasoning, right? And they're still not believing what they're seeing. The God who provides for them in the wilderness. They know this, they recite this story like every year as part of the Passover narrative, right? God providing manna in the wilderness. Like, this is ingrained in the culture. Do you still not see what's happening? So it seems to me that like the acts of deep compassion that we don't see Al-Masih doing, and that aren't marked in the same way as these, what should be deeply resonant narratives, it maybe makes it harder. Maybe that's why I wouldn't follow him.
You don't know if you're going to be provided for. I mean, you don't know if he's going to leave or not. They all come to Texas and he's just sitting in the tent. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, we don't know if we'll be provided for. Whereas the way Mark has organized his gospel, the one thing that's really clear is that you will be provided for. Like, it'll be okay, somehow. At least through the first 10 chapters.
Well, and I think too with Al-Masih, you're not necessarily sure what his motives are or like what his end game is. Whereas like, even though it's vague, you know, it's some sort of like political liberation, some sort of like redemption, like you like flipping the term good news on his head in the way that Jesus does. You know that he's going to be like disrupting and dismantling something in society. And if you're part of like a group that has been like oppressed by like the Roman government this time, and you're like, oh, that sounds pretty nice, like I want to join in that. You don't necessarily know how it's going to happen, but you want to be a part of it. Whereas with Al-Masih, you don't necessarily know what he's getting at until like the conversation that he has like with the president. You're like, all right, like this is a more political thing, and like the walking on the water in DC. So I think that's one of my intentions too, of like, you can kind of follow along with Jesus in this. You're like, okay, he's compassionate. He wants to like give in some sort of way. He wants to liberate and disrupt whatever this sort of like political system is. But with Al-Masih, you're like, oh, okay, he leads people into the desert and then he abandons them. And he doesn't necessarily seem like he has like an end game, and he doesn't really like heal people in the way that I like thought that he would, or like want him to. And so I think there's a lot of like tensions in like abiding with somebody like that.
Right. Yeah. And it seems to me that that's why chapter 5 becomes so important again, right? With the demoniac, and that it's Legion that's thrown out, and kind of reframing all of our narrative expectations in this book. That a lot is being demanded of you as a reader. You're having to figure out how you would respond to this person. But it's also reminding you that whatever is being disrupted, that whatever is being broken, whatever is being overturned, it has a lot more to do with overturning death, with overturning something far more fundamental to the human condition than just political oppression. Although political oppression is obviously something that leads to death and causes a whole lot of problems, but that somehow there's going to be something even deeper, even more profound that will happen, that won't just leave you in the desert, abandoned. Like maybe you finally get entrance into Palestine, but it's not going to stop there. It's not going to be, in some ways, what starts to feel like smaller actually in the Gospel of Mark, that changing the socio-political order, that would be good, but that sort of deep healing that the demoniac receives feels like it might be more profound somehow, or answering something even deeper, even darker within us, which is that the reality of death, that is, really the great enemy, right? That we fight, and that's the reason our socio-political systems matter, is because of the ways they foster systems or opportunities for life and flourishing, or the ways that they deny people life and flourishing, right? That's why it matters, not because one is necessarily better or worse than the other. It's because of whether or not they foster life and lead to people being able to have life, or lead to people suffering. So to only solve that problem, if you're not actually fostering life, you haven't really solved anything. You've just traded one bad system for a different bad system.
Right.
Which we don't need to say anything about U.S. politics. Right? I mean, but I think it does help us remember that, like, you can trade out one old white guy for another old white guy, and you probably won't get the sort of salvation you're really looking for.
Right.
And that's, I don't know, it seems like chapter 5 becomes really important for kind of opening up the entire rest of what's going on in here. I want to thank you guys so much for your time today. We will pick up with chapters 11 through 16 next week. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat through all this today.